Chapter 1: The March of the Emus. A swarm on the western horizon. It began like a mirage. At first glance, the horizon shimmered in the heat, the kind that made men squint and question whether the land itself was curling in upon its own thirst. But then came the movement, low, rhythmic, sweeping in slow waves like black brushstrokes across a canvas of ochre dust. Stopwatch. The emus had arrived. They didn't come in threes or tens, as farmers had seen in years past. No, this was something else entirely. Thousands upon thousands, marching not in formation but in instinct, guided by the season and the whisper of wind-blown seed. They had followed the rains from the inland deserts, as they had for generations, their slender legs carrying them over vast distances with the silence of ghosts. But this year the rains had failed elsewhere, and so they came to Western Australia. Break time equals 0. 25s/. The region, vast and underpopulated, had recently been promised to veterans returning from the Great War. The government, seeking to reward service and settle the land, had carved out parcels of farmland, handed over with minimal support, and left these former soldiers to wrestle life from stubborn soil. These men, stoic, proud, and already carrying the invisible wounds of war, now faced another front: an unyielding climate, poor infrastructure, and a crashing global economy. They planted anyway. They fenced what they could. They hoped. But what wheat had survived the sun now faced an enemy no bayonet could halt. The emus swept through the fields like tidewater. Their beaks tore stalks down at the root. Their feet trampled rows in chaotic lines. They were uninterested in human boundaries. Barbed wire meant nothing to birds who could leap 6 feet high and run over 30 miles an hour. Flocks broke apart and reconvened, swirling through the farmland like feathered cyclones. One man likened it to watching cavalry made of shadows. By late October of 1932, estimates placed their numbers near 20,000 in the Campion district alone. They were not malicious. They were simply doing what instinct demanded: moving, eating, surviving. And yet, to the farmers watching their harvest vanish beneath the relentless tide, it was as if nature had declared war. In local pubs and grain sheds, stories grew. Some men swore the emus had learned to bait dogs away while others feasted on grain. Others believed the birds were working in teams, circling back at night after reconnaissance during the day. It was absurd, but only just. What was certain was this: bullets fired into the air did nothing. Fences repaired one evening were breached by dawn. And as the days grew longer and the sun more unforgiving, the flocks showed no signs of retreat. A petition began to circulate. Local leaders, pushed by desperate farmers, drafted a formal request to the federal government. The problem, they argued, was not agricultural, it was military. Stopwatch. And so someone, perhaps out of sympathy, perhaps out of disbelief, pushed the request forward. It landed, as such things do, on the desk of someone who took it seriously enough. Enter Major GPW Meredith, a career officer in the Royal Australian Artillery. He was no stranger to deployment, but this new assignment would take him somewhere war had never quite reached: into the wheat fields of the West, armed not with strategy, but with Lewis machine guns. 2 guns, 2 soldiers, 1 truck, and 10,000 rounds. The newspapers caught wind before the dust had even settled. The Sydney Morning Herald called it a military operation against birds. Others mocked, bemused, and skeptical. But to the farmers, the arrival of the soldiers felt like hope, however strange its uniform. On the first morning of the campaign, the men set out before dawn. They had spotted a flock near a dam, over 1,000 birds in tight formation. They positioned themselves carefully. The gun was loaded. The order was given. The birds scattered. In every direction, like black lightning across the brush, the emus sprinted away in all directions. The gun jammed after just a few shots. When it was cleared, only a handful remained in sight. Of those, fewer still were hit. The soldiers looked at one another, unamused. The farmers said nothing. Over the next several days, the pattern repeated. Flocks were sighted, cornered, engaged, and vanished. The birds seemed to possess an uncanny ability to avoid concentrated fire. Some joked that they could hear the click of a safety being switched off. Even when the guns worked, the terrain fought back. The truck often got stuck in dry creek beds. The emus outran the gunners across stony ridges. At one point, Meredith himself observed, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." The absurdity of it all began to take root. But so too did a strange respect for the resilience, speed, and adaptability of these creatures. The war, if it could be called that, had begun. But it would not be swift. It would not be clean. And it would not be won. Only one thing was certain. Australia had never seen anything quite like this. Chapter 2, When the Fields Turned to Dust and Shadows. It began with a sound no farmer wished to hear, the hollow rustle of heavy bodies moving through dry stalks. Not the wind, not rain, not even cattle. It was something swifter, quieter, and utterly relentless. At first, it seemed like a trick of the eye, dark shapes in the distance, too upright to be kangaroos, too fast for sheep. Then came the unmistakable rhythm of hundreds of clawed feet brushing over the brittle wheat. The emus had come. Farms across Western Australia, especially around the Campion district, were already bruised by a decade of hardship. The Great Depression had hollowed out bank accounts and spirits alike. Then came drought. Crops grew thin, and the land cracked under the weight of heat. Farmers who had once stood proud behind their plows now stood quieter, their hands more calloused than ever, staring into shrinking harvests. But none of them had expected a feathered invasion. Tens of thousands of emus, tall, fast, flightless birds native to the heart of the continent, began migrating westward from the inland deserts. They were drawn, as all creatures are, by the promise of water and food. And there it lay, neat rows of wheat, soft soil, and irrigation lines that glimmered like distant lakes under the sun. To the emus, it was paradise. To the farmers, it was war. At night, the birds moved silently among the crops, their dark forms swaying like stalks themselves. During the day, they gathered in flocks of hundreds, descending upon the fields with surprising coordination. They trampled young plants underfoot, tore through fences, and drained precious water supplies meant for livestock. What the rabbits had chewed, the emus flattened. One farmer recounted watching a mob of birds moving like a tide. His entire field lost in a matter of hours. "It wasn't just the wheat," he said. "It was the way they looked at you. No fear. Like they knew we couldn't stop them." Efforts to fight back were laughably mismatched. Shotguns, when available, had limited range and even less effect. Emus, with their strong legs and muscular frames, could absorb a surprising amount of damage. Some were wounded and ran miles before collapsing. Others took a shot and kept on running, as if nothing had touched them. The birds didn't just come in waves, they came in formations. Small groups would break off from the larger flocks, striking at separate areas like trained scouts. They'd retreat into the brush when chased, only to return at dusk. It wasn't just destruction, it was disruption. The government had promised to support wheat prices after the war. But with the market collapsing and pests, feathered and otherwise, eating through every hope left in the soil, Western Australian farmers were on the brink. Some sent letters to the Ministry of Defence, others to Parliament. Their message was simple: "We fought for you, now fight for us." Many of the farmers were World War I veterans, men who had held rifles in the trenches of Europe. They now stood, humiliated, watching oversized birds tear through the very country they believed they had defended. And so came the unusual request. Could the government send soldiers to fight the emus? To modern ears, it sounds absurd. But in 1932, it was considered a reasonable plea. Desperation has a way of making strange things seem sensible. The emus were more than animals. They had become a symbol of helplessness, of being forgotten by the cities and leaders far away. George Pearce, Australia's Minister of Defence, approved the plan. It would be a military operation in name and structure. Soldiers would be sent to the wheat belt, armed with machine guns and plenty of ammunition. Thus began what would be remembered half as legend, half as farce as the Great Emu War. But none of that was clear yet to the people of Campion. All they knew, as the sun fell and the wind picked up across the empty land, was that the birds had not left, and that the first trucks from the army would arrive soon. They hoped help was coming. They did not yet know that the war they had summoned would become a story told for generations. Not one of victory, but of bewilderment. Chapter 3: A Soldier's March into the Wheat Fields. When the first military convoy rolled into the dry plains of Campion, Western Australia, the summer sun hung like a coin too bright to look at. The soldiers wore their uniforms with a strange air of formality, bayonets glinting not for men, but for birds. Trucks rattled over dirt tracks, kicking up clouds of red dust that settled over canvas tents and boots alike. This was no ordinary campaign. They weren't here to quell rebellion, defend a border, or seize territory. They were here to shoot emus. It sounded like a joke even to those enlisted. The order had come from high up. George Pierce, the Minister of Defense, had sanctioned the operation after hearing enough farmer pleas. And so, under the leadership of Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery, the first wave of military intervention against large, flightless birds began. The landscape was flat and yellowing, rippling with dry grasses and occasional scrub. Farmers gathered to watch the preparations. Some chuckled under their breath, others offered advice, pointing to distant clumps of trees where emus were known to hide. Children ran barefoot along the fence lines, hoping to see soldiers in action. The men brought Lewis guns, relics of World War I, with belts of ammunition slung over their shoulders. They positioned themselves at key locations where emu sightings had been frequent. The idea was simple: wait for a flock, then open fire. But the reality was far less predictable. Emus, it turned out, were not easy targets. They didn't behave like rows of advancing troops. They darted, scattered, split into unpredictable formations. A gunner would swing his weapon toward a group, only to find it vanished into the trees before he could pull the trigger. And when the guns did fire, it often resulted in little more than panic. The birds would scatter in all directions, leaving only dust behind. On one of the first days, a flock of over 50 was spotted near a dam. The soldiers crept into position, signaled readiness, and opened fire. The gun jammed after a few bursts. By the time it was fixed, most of the emus had fled. Only a handful were taken down. Major Meredith noted the birds' ability to withstand injury. Some were hit and ran for miles before collapsing. Others seemed to absorb bullets and continue without pause. They seemed to have an almost supernatural resistance. One soldier was quoted as saying later, "One of them took 5 shots straight to the body and kept running as if nothing had happened." Another day, the men mounted the Lewis gun on a truck in an attempt to chase down the birds across open ground. The result was chaos. The terrain was too rough. The gunner couldn't aim with the vehicle bouncing. The emus outran the truck with ease, veering off into gullies and scrub. Not a single bird was hit. Meanwhile, newspapers began reporting on the strange campaign. Headlines ranged from bemused to mocking. "Emus outmaneuver troops. Military humbled by feathered foes." Cartoonists had a field day. The public, first sympathetic to the farmers' plight, now watched with a blend of disbelief and amusement. But for the farmers, the stakes were real. Each day lost to military misfires was another day of crops trampled and ruined. Every bullet spent with no effect was another reminder that nature, once again, refused to yield to modern man's designs. Still, the campaign continued. Despite setbacks, Meredith remained determined. He wrote detailed reports, tallying each bird taken down, though the numbers were embarrassingly low. The operation became a game of patience, trial, and error. Soldiers developed an odd respect for their enemy. "The emus are remarkably hard to outwit," one wrote in a letter. "They travel in formation, have a sentry posted, and scatter with remarkable discipline. The war had just begun, but already it was clear. This would not be won by brute force alone. Not every campaign is decided by steel and fire. Some, curiously, are determined by feathers and silence. Chapter 4: Emu Tactics. The strange intelligence of a flightless bird. They had no feathers for flight, no fangs for defense, no battle cries to shake the trees. And yet, somehow, the emus were winning. Not by charging like horses or striking like predators, but by doing what no military commander in uniform had anticipated: disappearing into the land like ghosts in the scrub. In the golden hush of early morning, the fields of Campion shimmered with heat. Soldiers stood poised behind the mounted Lewis guns, scanning the horizon for silhouettes. From time to time, a rustle, a faint thud, a movement just beyond the wheat rows. But when they turned to fire, the target was gone. The emus did not gather information. They did not march or circle or defend territory. They scattered, hundreds of them, into smaller bands that zigzagged across the bushland, slipping between tree trunks, hiding in tall grasses, and darting past fences like shadows. It was less a retreat than a calculated evasion. Captain Meredith, a veteran of the Western Front, had never seen an enemy so hard to pin down. His reports, written in dry military prose, concealed a quiet disbelief. The birds moved too fast, too unpredictably. They seemed to understand instinctively when a trap had been laid. The first ambush had been textbook. A large flock sighted near a dam. The men moved in quietly, set up the machine gun, waited for the signal. But as the first shot rang out, the flock broke. Not in a panic, but with sudden coordination. Most scattered sideways into the thick brush, vanishing from view. A few dashed toward the horizon, zigzagging just enough to ruin the gunner's aim. Of over 100 birds, only a handful fell. And so it continued. The soldiers adapted. They mounted the guns on trucks. They took to chasing the birds across open ground. But the terrain was uneven, and the trucks bounced violently over rutted dirt roads. The guns jammed. The targets slipped through holes in the fences, vanished into gullies, vanished altogether. Sometimes it seemed the emus had scouts. Lone birds would appear at the edge of a clearing, staring silently. If the soldiers moved too quickly, the bird would bolt. If they waited too long, it would retreat. But always, within minutes, the larger flock would shift course, as if warned. There were stories among the locals, half laughing, half serious, of a particularly tall emu with a white feather across its brow. They called him the General, always at the center of the action, always the last to flee and never struck. Some swore they saw him lead breakaways, circling back to draw attention while the rest escaped. Of course, this was likely coincidence. Emus, after all, were not trained tacticians. But what they lacked in education, they made up for in sensory strength and sheer adaptability. They could see further than a human, pick up the shimmer of sunlight off metal, detect the shift of wind. And above all, they could run, not in straight lines but in loops and curves, through thick cover and rough terrain, covering 20 miles in a day without pause. Each encounter ended the same way. The birds outmaneuvered the soldiers. The farmers watched with a kind of stunned silence. Here were battle-hardened men with automatic weapons, outsmarted by flocks of oversized, flightless birds. The emus seemed to understand what areas held danger. They avoided wide clearings after the first skirmish. They moved at dawn and dusk, when the light was low and shadows played tricks. They broke into smaller groups at the sound of approaching vehicles. Even the gunners, begrudgingly, began to speak of them with a kind of respect. "They're not stupid, these birds," one soldier noted. "They don't fight like men. They vanish like mist." There was no body count worth reporting. Bullets were spent, sweat poured, tires blew. And yet the grain fields were still flattened, fences still torn, and every morning brought the same sight. Emus, unconcerned, pecking at fallen stalks, indifferent to the efforts of a modern army. In a different war, on a different continent, this might have been considered a minor tactical setback. But here, in the wide, lonely stretches of Western Australia, it became something else entirely, a quiet humiliation. The birds had no speeches to give, no declarations to make. They had no need for parliaments or newspapers. They simply persisted, and in that persistence, they exposed the fragile line between control and illusion. The soldiers controlled their guns. The emus controlled the land. And as days turned to weeks, the men began to understand. This was not a campaign that would end in a glorious photo. No flag would be raised. No general's orders would be obeyed by birds. This was a war that did not follow human logic. What do you do when the thing you're fighting does not recognize that it's in a fight? What happens when your opponent doesn't care whether you win or lose? You learn to adapt, or you lose quietly, absurdly, feather by feather. Chapter 5: Emus Information, Tactics of Feather and Fury. At first glance, it was easy to dismiss the emus as little more than oversized, slightly confused birds running amok across the wheat fields of Western Australia. But as the days turned into weeks and the casualties mounted, not among the birds, but among the soldiers' pride, it became increasingly clear that these birds were not simply fleeing. They were maneuvering. From the observation posts scattered across the region, farmers and military personnel began to note strange patterns. Emus did not move aimlessly. They traveled in tight clusters, like miniature phalanxes of feathers. One soldier swore he saw a group of 20 emus circle back around a gully to retrieve a fallen comrade. Another reported seeing the birds perform a perfect flanking maneuver around a machine gun nest. Lieutenant Meredith, the man in charge of the operation, began to suspect what few dared to say aloud. The emus had a command structure. Not a formal one, of course. There were no generals with medals or lieutenants issuing orders from maps. But somewhere in those clusters of bobbing heads and stampeding feet, a system of instinctive intelligence was at work. They seemed to communicate without sound, moving in bursts that responded to threats with uncanny precision. When gunfire erupted, they scattered in all directions, then regrouped. When vehicles gave chase, they split into smaller units, darting into the bush where no wheels could follow. Every encounter was met with a response. Not chaos, strategy. The press began to take notice. Headlines across the country turned from triumphalism to ridicule. Emus outwit Australian Army, blared one paper. Feathered menace evades capture yet again, declared another. Satirists had a field day. Cartoons depicted the birds wearing tin hats and peering through binoculars. Some were even shown planning attacks around little tables strewn with seed. The absurdity of it all struck a chord with the public. If Australia's modern, motorized army could not subdue a flightless bird, what did that say about the nature of control? Of empire? Of pride? Beneath the satire, there simmered a deeper question about hubris, one feathered footstep at a time. Farmers, of course, were less amused. Their wheat continued to vanish beneath stomping claws and pecking beaks. The emus weren't destroying crops out of spite. They were simply following instinct. But instinct or not, the economic toll was mounting. Letters poured into Parliament begging for more troops, more guns, even bounties. Some suggested building fences. Others, in desperation, proposed landmines. Yet no tactics seemed to matter. One day, a unit set up a perfect ambush near a watering hole. The emus approached. The gunners waited. The birds stopped, turned, and vanished into the trees before a single shot was fired. "How do they know?" one soldier muttered. "It's like they smell the bullets." The deeper they went into the countryside, the more stories emerged. Farmers told tales of an especially large emu with a scar across its breast, one that seemed to lead the charges. That one, a rancher whispered, he watches, doesn't run, just watches. He'd been nicknamed the Major. Perhaps it was fanciful to imagine an emu with military rank. But for men used to order and logic, it helped explain the inexplicable. And when the official tally came in, over 10,000 rounds of ammunition used and fewer than 1,000 confirmed emu casualties, the scorecard looked grim. The birds were winning, not with weapons but with silence, with speed, with the sheer audacity of existing, and perhaps most of all, with each failed human ambush, the emus gained something that armies fear most in an enemy: confidence. Chapter 6: Parliament Responds. How do you explain losing to a bird? In the polished chambers of Parliament House in Canberra, where the air smelled faintly of ink and polished wood, a peculiar unease had begun to spread. It was not the kind born of foreign threats or economic collapse. It was something far more absurd, an embarrassment feathered and flightless, wreaking havoc over wheat fields thousands of miles away. The Emu War, as the public now called it with growing amusement, had become a national spectacle. What began as a regional nuisance had, through newspaper headlines and the cruel precision of satire, risen to the highest levels of government. Parliamentarians, many of whom had never laid eyes on an emu outside of postage stamps or school textbooks, now found themselves forced to debate the most improbable of topics. How could the National Army, armed with Lewis guns and field support, be so thoroughly bested by birds? A debate was called. The chamber, typically half asleep during sessions on wheat subsidies and trade tariffs, was unexpectedly full. Reporters filled the gallery. Some arrived early, eager to witness history, or at least irony, unfold in real time. The Minister for Defense, his spectacles fogged slightly from nerves, approached the podium. His speech, carefully worded by aides who had tried to strike a balance between seriousness and satire, began. Honorable members, let us first acknowledge that the emu is a uniquely Australian bird, resilient, independent, and, as recent events suggest, highly mobile. A ripple of laughter passed through the benches. And while it is not customary for this House to concern itself with fauna in the context of military strategy, the situation in Western Australia has escalated to such an extent that it now demands our considered attention. He paused. There it was again, the unavoidable absurdity. He was, in effect, trying to rationalize a war against wild birds. Another member, rising from the back bench, asked bluntly, "And what precisely is the tactical objective? Are we to declare victory only when the last feather falls?" A chorus of amused murmurs followed. In the press gallery, a journalist scribbled, "Birds 1, bureaucracy 0." But beneath the laughter, real concerns simmered. The farmers of the Western wheat belt were suffering. Entire harvests had been lost to the emu's relentless trampling and grazing. Fences were overrun, crops flattened. For many, the birds were not a joke. They were ruin. One rural MP stood to deliver a sobering statement. "Gentlemen, these are not rogue chickens. These are 6-foot-tall, armor-plated nightmares, and our boys are out there with machine guns that jam in the dust. This is not farce, it is failure." The room quieted. An inquiry was proposed, an internal review of the military operation, its cost, and its lack of measurable success. There were whispers of reallocating funds to fence construction rather than gunpowder. Others pushed for a bounty system, empowering farmers to take matters into their own hands with government rewards per emu carcass. One voice, half joking, half serious, suggested offering the birds land of their own, declaring a sort of feathery sovereign state within the wheat belt. "Let them govern themselves," he mused, "if they're so clever." Still, amid the clamor, no clear solution emerged. To abandon the military operation altogether would be to admit defeat, and no politician, however pragmatic, wished to be remembered as the man who surrendered to emus. Outside the halls of Parliament, the public watched with a mix of disbelief and glee. Radio hosts staged mock battle updates. Children in Melbourne played games called Emu Commander, chasing each other with feathered hats and cardboard rifles. In pubs from Perth to Sydney, toasts were raised, "To our bird overlords." And still, in the dusty paddocks of Western Australia, the emus marched on, unconcerned with legislation or headlines. They cared nothing for committees or inquiries. All they knew was that the wheat was ripe, the sun was warm, and the odd loud bang meant it was time to scatter, then regroup. parliament, for all its rules and rituals, was now in a standoff not just with birds, but with its own dignity. For in the heart of Australia, the Great Emu War had become something more than conflict. It had become a mirror, and what it reflected, most inconveniently, was that even the best-laid plans of men can be undone by a creature with no plan at all. Chapter 7: Feathered Folklore: How Emus Became National Legends. Long after the machine guns cooled and the military trucks rumbled home in defeat, the emus remained. Not just in the fields, where they still strutted past fences like self-appointed lords of the grain, but in stories, tall tales traded over firelight, half-remembered anecdotes whispered between barstools, and bedtime fables told to children with grins half-proud, half-ashamed. The emu, once just a strange bird with powerful legs and a surprisingly empty head, had become something else entirely: a legend. In the wheat belt towns where the war had first been waged, old farmers began to speak of the birds with an odd mixture of resentment and admiration. They talked of their uncanny speed, not just in running, but in disappearing behind the shimmer of heat-hazed horizons. Some claimed they had seen emus circle around bullets like smoke. Others swore that certain flocks had a leader, an unusually large emu with a jagged scar above one eye, a general in feathers, as one ex-soldier called him. Children gave this mythic bird names like Emperor Emu or Featherfoot. In sketches and school plays, he wore a stolen army helmet or bore a bandolier of wheat stalks slung across his chest. What had once been an agricultural crisis slowly mutated into a kind of national inside joke. An episode too absurd to ignore, too revealing to forget. Cartoonists had a field day. In newspapers across the country, they drew emus attending peace talks with generals, sipping tea with long beaks and inscrutable eyes. One memorable cartoon showed an emu behind a desk labeled War Office, pointing at a map of Australia and saying, "Next, we take Canberra." Songs emerged, first in bush ballads, then in city cabarets. One popular tune, set to a jaunty accordion rhythm, sang, "Oh, the emus march at dawn, they don't need boots or brass. They raid the fields with silent pride and trample every pass. The soldiers came with bullets bright, the birds just laughed and fled. For every time a gun would jam, a feathered scout dropped dead." There was a strange joy in the humiliation, an almost cathartic release. In a country so often defined by drought, hardship, and distant wars, here was a fiasco that belonged entirely to Australia. It was absurd, yes, but it was theirs. And so the story spread, growing with every telling. Tourists asked about the Great Emu War at train stations and country post offices. Foreign journalists picked it up, sometimes not quite believing it wasn't fiction. Radio hosts ran mock reenactments on air, complete with fake gunfire and dramatic emu screeches. Back in the small towns where the war had begun, the locals leaned into it. Road signs were amended, "Welcome to Campion," proudly defeated by emus. Gift shops started selling feathered hats and emu-shaped bottle openers. One local pub even served a drink called the Flightless Victory, a strong mix of rum and ginger beer, served with a feather sticking out the top. But beneath the laughter, there was also a subtle thread of something more meaningful. The emus had, in their own strange way, highlighted the absurdity of bureaucracy, the limits of force, and the unpredictable genius of nature. For those who had fought in the war, not against men but birds, there was a quiet dignity in their stories. They spoke not of glory, but of odd mornings in the dust, of emus that vanished into mirage, and of the awkwardness of explaining to their children how a Lewis gun could not stop a bird with strong legs and a stubborn heart. And so the emu stepped across a line from pest to folk hero, not because of anything they had intended, but because of what they came to represent. Resilience, audacity, the wild refusal to obey the rules of human planning. In the national imagination, the Great Emu War became less about defeat and more about the kind of chaos only Australia could produce. A sun-drenched epic where logic took a nap and birds inherited the field. And in the heat-hazed stillness of the wheat fields, the emus kept walking, unbothered, unaware. Victors not by strategy but by sheer, ridiculous persistence. Chapter 8: A Farmer's War. Life after the guns went quiet. The emus never signed a peace treaty. No white flag was raised among the thistles. When the last truck rolled away and the soldiers folded their orders into quiet drawers, the birds simply remained. Silent, tall, feathered monuments to a campaign that ended not in triumph, but in tall grass and chewed crops. For the farmers of Western Australia, however, the real war wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. With the military gone, the burden of defense fell back onto calloused hands and rusting fences. It was no longer a matter of headlines or politics. It was a daily struggle, quiet and personal, fought with stubbornness and sandpapered patience. Each morning, the same routine played out across the wheat belt. The wind would lift the dust from tired fields, and somewhere in the distance, the dull thump-thump of emu feet would begin. They came in groups, sometimes just a pair, sometimes dozens, moving like ghosts through fence lines that were no match for their strength or curiosity. The damage they left behind wasn't theatrical. It didn't come with battle cries or explosions. It came as silence. Chewed seedlings, crushed furrows, a harvest whispered away in the stillness of dusk. A farmer might walk his field in the morning and find only prints in the dirt, deep as fists. But farmers, too, have their own kind of persistence. In place of rifles and ranks, they deployed scarecrows made of old jackets and broomsticks. They strung tin cans along wire fences, hoping the clatter might spook a curious bird. Some dug trenches, some lit fires, others tried shouting into the wind. None of it worked for long. One man in Meriden fashioned a homemade catapult from a wagon spring and old belts, hurling rocks at emus like a medieval sentry. Another in Narrabeen reportedly trained his sheepdog to bark only at birds taller than a child. The emus, unimpressed, simply adapted, stepping wider, waiting longer, watching. Yet even in the frustration, there was a strange affection. Farmers cursed them, but they also admired them. There was something noble in the birds' refusal to be tamed, something poetic in how they walked straight through human invention as if it were smoke. The government, meanwhile, returned to doing what governments often do when reality misbehaves: forming committees. Reports were filed, proposals written. Plans emerged to subsidize fencing or offer bounties. Some of it helped, most of it didn't. And so, a different kind of wisdom began to settle in. The wisdom of working with nature rather than against it. Farmers who once railed against the emus began building taller, more flexible fences, not to trap, but to gently dissuade. Crops were rotated, tactics adjusted. A quiet truce began to take shape, not official, not agreed upon, but observed in the dusty rhythm of daily life. Children learned to recognize emu tracks before they could spell emu. Dogs grew up knowing the sound of a bird's stride before they knew thunder. The war faded, but its imprint remained, etched not in metals, but in the way gates were fastened or how a man paused at the horizon when a shadow moved just so. There were still hard days. There always would be. Sometimes entire fields would fall to a sudden flock. Sometimes it felt like nothing had changed at all. But over time, the emu became less a threat and more a fact, like wind or drought or distant thunder. Not the enemy, but part of the landscape. And in the cool evenings, as golden light stretched across furrows and the air grew still, farmers would sometimes spot them in the distance. Tall shapes moving through stubble, heads high, feathers ruffling in the breeze. They watched and sometimes even smiled. The battle had ended long ago, but the lesson remained. You could fire bullets at a bird. You could send generals into paddocks. But in the end, some problems are better met not with war, but with the quiet, patient adjustments of those who know the land, live in its rhythms, and understand that the truest victories aren't won, they're adapted to. And so life went on. The wheat grew, the emus wandered, and the story, the strange, feathered chapter of history, was passed from one pair of dusty boots to the next. Chapter 9: The Emu Whisperers. unlikely friendships on the fringe. Long after the soldiers had left and the official records stopped counting bird casualties, a quieter movement began to take root in the outer paddocks of Western Australia. It wasn't documented in government files or spoken of in the halls of Parliament. But it was real, stitched gently into the daily rhythms of isolated homesteads and long, silent plains. These were not warriors or politicians. They were not scientists or strategists. They were simply people who, for one reason or another, stopped seeing emus as enemies and started seeing them as something else entirely. It began, as many strange things do, with a child. In a dusty corner of Walgullen, a boy named Arthur had wandered off from his chores, following the sound of low grunting beyond the fence line. What he found wasn't danger, but a lone emu chick, wobbly-legged, fluff-speckled, blinking at him with oversized curiosity. Arthur named it Butterball. He fed it mashed wheat from a tin lid and whistled the same tune every morning. Days passed, then weeks, and Butterball followed him everywhere, through the hay shed, under laundry lines, even to the back step where his mother, arms crossed, offered the bird a skeptical glance and a slice of old damper. Word spread, as it always does in small communities where news moves faster than the post. Soon others began to share their own encounters. An emu that trailed a mailman for 6 kilometers, another that nested beside a rabbit trapper's hut without so much as a ruffled feather. They weren't tame, not exactly, but they weren't entirely wild either. These birds, at least a few, seemed willing to coexist, curious in a way that hinted at something stranger than instinct. And for those living on the margins, who knew the loneliness of wind and wheat and long distances between neighbors, that curiosity felt oddly welcome. One elderly woman named Mavis reportedly taught her yard emu to come when she tapped her teacup with a spoon. He arrived punctually each morning at 10, peering in through the screen door until she pushed a crust of toast through the mesh. Another man, Alfie Dunn, fashioned a saddle from Hessian and tried, unsuccessfully, to ride one. The bird bucked like a rodeo bull and ran halfway to Kalgoorlie before stopping. Alfie walked home with bruised pride but insisted it was the best ride of his life. Some of these relationships were accidental. Others seemed almost inevitable. A few were nothing more than coincidence dressed in sentiment. But together, they told a quiet truth. Not everyone wanted to fight the emus. Some just wanted to understand them. In time, these strange bonds became stories, told around kitchen tables, written in the margins of old journals, whispered over fence posts at dusk. Children grew up knowing not just the myths of war, but the softer legends. The emu that stole laundry pegs, the one that waited at the school gate, the bird that let a farmer scratch its neck like a dog. Scientists would later observe that emus, for all their aloofness, are deeply observant creatures. They remember faces, recognize routes, even mimic behaviors when it suits them. Perhaps the birds were adapting to humans as much as the other way around. Or perhaps they were simply bored. In any case, the truce, unspoken and uneven, was holding. There were still raids on crops, still footprints in fields where there shouldn't have been any. But there were also moments of stillness, of understanding. A look across the dry earth, a feather left near the fence. A nod, of sorts, between two very different species who had once gone to war. And if someone, say, a traveling journalist, were to ask these farmers and fringe dwellers what had changed, they might just shrug and say, "We got used to them," but the truth was deeper. In a land where the lines between enemy and neighbor blur like heat on the horizon, it wasn't about winning. It was about living, side by side. And in that quiet companionship, something gentle had taken root. A kind of peace not declared, but practiced. Not official, but real. Chapter 10: The Bureaucrats' Regret. What the Reports Left Out. In a narrow office lined with cabinets and carbon paper, someone had to write the final report. A clerk in khaki. A man with a typewriter and a gnawing unease. While the press moved on and the field officers packed away their uniforms, the paperwork remained. And so too did the memory of what really happened. This chapter belongs not to the battlefield, but to the desk. To the file folders marked Miscellaneous Fauna Engagements. To the tired hands that tried to reframe a botched campaign into language the public wouldn't laugh at. It began with a memo innocuous at first. A notice from the Department of Defense asking for final tallies, operational notes, and lessons learned. Major Meredith's field notes were sparse. Numbers scratched in the margins. Rain delays circled in red. One page reads simply, "They adapt." Back in Canberra, an overworked analyst, let's call him Lyons, was tasked with digesting the mess. His job was not to judge, only to translate the absurd into the acceptable. Yet the more he read, the less sense it made. The rounds expended did not match the confirmed emu casualties. The logistical costs outstripped projections. And morale reports from troops in Campion hinted at something deeper, something between frustration and awe. Lyons hesitated. What did one write when the war wasn't lost to an enemy but to nature's own stubborn design? How did one phrase inconclusive without admitting defeat? He began typing, "Operation Emu Control encountered unforeseen challenges due to the mobility, environmental adaptation, and unpredictable dispersal patterns of the target population." Then paused. He retyped, "Despite concentrated efforts, the emu population demonstrated a level of tactical dispersal and resilience that rendered conventional methods ineffective." Still too honest. He tried again. "Further study is advised regarding population management techniques and alternative strategies." They're passive, evasive, suitably bureaucratic. No mention of retreat. No mention of the birds' speed or their capacity to outflank mounted soldiers. No admission that a large-scale military effort had been thwarted by oversized foul. But as he prepared to file the report, Lyons felt a strange tug. A guilt not born of failure, but of omission. Because what wasn't written down was this: the birds had won. Not by fighting, but by being. By scattering when shot at, by darting behind scrub, by outlasting machine gun bursts. By refusing to behave like enemies, and thereby making every soldier's training useless. So he left something hidden. Not in the main report, but in a footnote. A quiet line buried in technical language. Observed subject displays exceptional terrain intuition and nonlinear response under pressure. That was all. But perhaps it was enough. Enough for someone, years later, to read between the lines and glimpse the truth. That Australia had gone to war with emus and found itself outclassed. In the end, the reports were filed. The war, such as it was, closed. But the regret lingered. Not just that the campaign had failed, but that no one would speak of it honestly.
No medals. No manllaments.
Only archives and silence. And somewhere deep within a government basement, a file marked Emu Incident 1932 still collects dust. Chapter 11 echoes across the saltbush, a war that refused to be forgotten. In the heart of the Western Australian plains, where the soil turns red and the wind hums through the saltbush like a forgotten song, the emus still walked, heads bobbing with a rhythm only they understood. By the time the military's final reports had gathered dust in government drawers, something else had begun to spread. Not feathers or bullets, but stories. It began in the pubs. Over foaming mugs of beer and slices of pie, locals recalled the sight of trucks jamming their gears as they chased emus into the brush. Children imitated the long-legged stride of the enemy bird with theatrical exaggeration. Farmers, no longer sharpening bayonets but counting feed bags, recounted how the creatures had outwitted machines meant for men. The newspapers, perhaps sensing that the battle had shifted from battlefield to parlor room, adjusted their tone. What had once been reported as strategic deployment was now spoken of with bemusement. Cartoonists had a field day, sketching emus wearing generals' caps or riding victorious on tanks. But there was something deeper happening beneath the satire. something that nestled itself into the bones of the story and refused to leave. For all its absurdity, the Emu War had unearthed a quiet truth: that nature, once dismissed as a backdrop, had its own ways of fighting back. The land didn't bend easily. Neither did the creatures that called it home. Historians, decades later, would sit in archives and read the reports not just for data, but for insight into a country still young in its federated form, testing not only the power of its military, but the shape of its national myth. Letters written by soldiers who participated in the campaign spoke not of glory or gallantry, but of long days under a searing sun, of birds too fast to aim at, and of wondering aloud what it meant to be a soldier when your enemy didn't fire back, only ran, laughed, perhaps, and returned again at dusk. Among the farmers, too, reflections changed over time. Some who had once cursed the government's failure later came to see the emus as part of the cycle, the same cycle that brought floods and droughts, locusts and bumper crops. There was no single villain, only the chaos of a land still finding its balance with those who had settled it. At schools, the tale entered the curriculum not as tragedy or triumph, but as curiosity. A war without winners, a campaign where the birds marched on and the humans left scratching their heads. And perhaps in that confusion, there was something profoundly Australian. A larrikin spirit, an acceptance that not everything must be conquered, and that some stories are best told with a wink. And so the echoes of the war, though no longer reverberating through gunfire or fleeing emus, settled into a quieter kind of immortality. In roadside museums and folklore festivals, in the tilt of a bronze emu statue outside a rural council building, and in the knowing smile of anyone who'd ever tried to outwit nature and failed. It was not just a war that had refused to be won. It was a war that refused to be forgotten. Chapter 12: A Bird in the Dossier. How the government explained it all away. Somewhere in a quiet corner of Canberra, in a filing cabinet stamped Department of Defense, there rests a document that few speak of openly. It is not classified. It is not marked in red ink or sealed with wax. And yet, its presence has the weight of something ghostly. Its title? Report on Emu Operations, Campion District, 1932. Written in dry bureaucratic prose, it attempts the impossible, to explain how the Australian military deployed men, trucks, and machine guns to fight a bird and lost. The report contains figures, tables, and references to effective strikes. It notes with some regret the number of bullets fired, over 9,000, and the estimated number of emus eliminated, perhaps 1,000. The math, even then, was unflattering. Major Meredith's name appears in neutral tones, though one imagines the pages turning more slowly where his account begins. He did not ask for fame, nor did he expect ridicule, and yet his report reads like a man who has walked into a storm with nothing but a tea towel. "We found the birds scattered in groups," he writes. "They demonstrated remarkable coordination and were extremely difficult to ambush." That sentence, dry as dust, conceals a universe of frustration. What the good major did not include, though surely he felt it, was that the emus had operated like phantoms, vanishing into scrub the moment the trucks gave chase, doubling back when the gunners jammed their weapons, slipping into ravines like shadows. The report tried valiantly to be respectable, to turn chaos into columned order. It even proposed suggestions for future campaigns, improvements to vehicle mobility, perhaps lighter weaponry. But there is something almost endearing in how the bureaucratic voice stumbles around the truth it dare not say: that this war had not gone to plan, and that the birds had won. In Parliament, the issue was raised only briefly, tucked between agricultural subsidies and railway extensions. No politician wanted to be the one associated too closely with the campaign. To do so would invite mockery. A few brave souls made jokes at their own expense. Most said little and waited for the laughter to pass. But beyond the corridors of power, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Farmers shared copies of the report like relics from a lost religion. Academics quoted its euphemisms with scholarly delight. And children, decades later, would act out the saga in school plays, often with paper wings and cardboard rifles. Even the emus, though unaware of the paper trail they'd left behind, continued their stately marches across the outback. In a way, they had become symbols of something larger. Not just resistance, but absurdity itself. In a world that often made no sense, the Emu War was a reminder that nature, like comedy, refused to be controlled. Today, visitors to the National Archives may stumble upon the Emu War files with a puzzled expression. Was it real? They ask, and the archivist, smiling softly, will nod and gesture to the page. Real, yes, all too real. And yet, within the dusty pages, there remains something inexplicable. A question left hanging like an empty cartridge in the breeze. Why did we do it? And why, despite everything, do we still laugh? Chapter 13, The Emu Strikes Back. How the Birds Became National Icons. In the years that followed the Great Emu War, something curious happened. The emus, once seen as agricultural pests and feathered saboteurs of wheat fields, began to drift into the soft haze of folklore. What had once been a nuisance with long legs and a pecking habit was slowly reimagined as something nobler, an unlikely champion of resilience, wit, and feathered rebellion. The transformation did not occur overnight. It began, perhaps, with the quiet chuckles of storytellers around campfires, retelling the battle not as a failure, but as a farce so grand it had to mean something. Then came the cartoons. Gallant emus with glinting eyes and military helmets, striding through fields as if they'd inherited the very spirit of bushrangers. Satirical columns followed, comparing political stumbles to another fine emu operation. The birds, whether they liked it or not, had become avatars of irreverence. In schools, the story was quietly folded into local history lessons. Teachers would speak of the campaign with a sigh and a grin, reminding students that even the best-laid plans can be undone by nature's most underestimated creatures. It was, they would say, a lesson in humility, in unintended comedy, in the limits of firepower. By the time the 1960s rolled in, the emus had fully stepped into their new role. Tourism brochures in Western Australia included sly references to the undefeated warriors of the outback. Small-town bakeries sculpted feathered statues from bread dough. Somewhere in Kalgoorlie, a pub even changed its name to the Emu's Revenge. But beneath the whimsy, something else stirred, a subtle shift in the national psyche. The emu, already immortalized on Australia's coat of arms alongside the kangaroo, now carried deeper layers of meaning. If the kangaroo represented forward momentum, since it cannot walk backward, the emu had become the patron saint of persistence. The joke had grown legs, very long, fast ones, and refused to sit down. Veterans of the campaign, now older and grayer, sometimes told the story with a chuckle and a squint into the sun. We never had a chance, one might admit while sipping tea on a veranda. Smart birds knew the land better than we ever could. And just like that, the emus crossed over from ridicule to reverence. Museums added humble exhibits, rusted casings, faded field maps, the odd photo of soldiers beside massive, bewildered birds. But it was not the weapons or uniforms that drew smiles. It was the absurdity, the warmth of a nation able to laugh at itself, to honor a failure not with shame but with storytelling. In children's books, the emus no longer ran from bullets. They led clever campaigns against overbearing generals, foiling human efforts with pranks and camouflage. One popular tale imagined a council of elder emus holding strategy meetings by moonlight. The birds were not only smart, they were wise. Even in art galleries, the war found a place. A mixed-media sculpture titled Flightless and Fearless depicted an emu standing atop a defunct Lewis gun, its feathers rippling like flags of triumph. Tourists took selfies beside it. Locals just nodded knowingly. And so, through quiet subversion and cultural osmosis, the emu found its revenge, not through violence, but through memory, through laughter, through the strange, enduring affection of a people who realized that maybe, just maybe, being bested by a bird was the most Australian thing imaginable. Chapter 14, From Battlefield to Billboard. How the Emu War entered pop culture. By the time the last field notes had yellowed in military archives and the Outback's dust had long since settled, the Emu War had taken flight in an entirely different direction. Not as tragedy, not even as folly, but as folklore and then, somehow, as entertainment. It began innocently enough. A radio sketch show in the 1980s aired a segment where a fictional military historian wept openly while recounting the heroic resistance of the Emu infantry. The segment was so absurd, so brilliantly delivered, that listeners weren't sure whether it was real history or just clever satire. But the laughter was real, and the myth only grew. Soon, the Emu War found itself on t-shirts. Not the solemn kind. These bore slogans like, "Support our troops," "Feathery Division," or "Emu 1, Army 0. Tourist shops in Perth began selling commemorative mugs showing a bird saluting while standing on a sandbag trench. No one quite knew when the shift had happened, but the war had become a symbol of something distinctly Australian: the ability to laugh in the face of absurdity. Television didn't lag far behind. A children's animated series aired for one season in the early 2000s, depicting a platoon of talking emus trained in guerrilla tactics. In it, the birds wore tiny boots and communicated via head bobs and coordinated foot stomps. They always outwitted the hapless military commander, who grew increasingly baffled by their intellect. It was both ridiculous and oddly touching. Indie filmmakers couldn't resist the tale. One mockumentary, Feathers of War, premiered at a fringe film festival and featured dramatic reenactments with slow-motion battle scenes. Soldiers falling into emu ambushes while Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries blared in the background. Audiences howled. It won the People's Choice Award. The internet naturally supercharged it all. Memes flourished. Strategic genius emus in sunglasses stood beside confused generals holding malfunctioning Lewis guns. A webcomic reimagined the Emu War as a Game of Thrones-style epic, complete with feuding clans of birds and betrayals across desert dunes. Podcasters took up the tale with a reverent wink. True crime shows dedicated special episodes to Australia's Most Wanted and Flightless. History channels debated whether the war was technically even a war. One popular episode opened with the question, "What do you call it when 20,000 birds outsmart a machine gun? A lesson, parable, a warning?" But perhaps most telling was the way people started using it in everyday speech. A failed group project? Bit of an emu war, that one. A poorly organized event? They emu warred the whole thing. The story had slipped from history into metaphor. A linguistic patch of dry grass that caught fire and kept on burning. Universities held informal debates. Could modern military tactics have succeeded? Should the campaign be taught in leadership courses, not as success but as satire? Professors argued earnestly, students sipped their coffees, and somewhere in the back row, someone doodled an emu in a general's cap. And so the war lived on, not in casualty counts or medals, but in laughter and the national lexicon. It became a kind of cultural mirror, a feathered joke that no one wanted to forget, a reminder that even serious institutions, with all their budgets and blueprints, can still lose a battle to creatures with no wings for flying, but all the cunning for survival. Chapter 15: The Long Shadow of a Feathered Victory. Long after the guns went silent and the emus resumed their dust-hued wanderings across the Murchison Plains, the echoes of the Great Emu War remained. Not as thunder, but as chuckle, as myth, as lesson. Not every war leaves behind craters. Some leave feathers caught in the wind. For the soldiers who returned to their barracks in late 1932, there were no medals, no commendations, only the quiet understanding that they had faced a truly stubborn opponent and lost spectacularly. George Pierce, the Minister of Defense who had once greenlit the campaign with bureaucratic poise, remained conspicuously silent in the aftermath. One imagines he never mentioned the emus again at dinner parties. The Western Australian farmers, though still battling crop loss, learned to turn to fences, compensation schemes, and eventually aviation wire. Strategies that involved fewer bullets and fewer birds. The government, perhaps sheepishly, provided subsidies and listened more carefully to rural voices in the years that followed. The emus, for their part, remained exactly as they had always been: tireless, adaptable, and vaguely amused by human confusion. But the war had stirred something deeper than just media curiosity. It became a folk tale whispered across generations, told beside barbecues and school desks. Parents recited it to children in tones of mock solemnity. In the year 1932, we lost a war to birds, and the children, wide-eyed and giggling, asked, "But how? Weren't we smarter?" That, perhaps, was the legacy no general had expected. The Emu War became a parable, not of defeat, but of humility. It reminded Australians, and all who heard the tale, that nature is not an enemy to be conquered, but a wild and wandering force best met with understanding, not gunfire. Years later, conservationists would point to the Emu War as an early example of the folly of brute intervention. Rather than adapt to the land, the military had tried to force the land to adapt to them, and been pecked back for the effort. The emu, already an enduring symbol of Australia's landscape, became something more: an unintentional ambassador of ecological resilience. In Canberra, a single dusty plaque in a small military archive noted the campaign, its tone neutral and brief. It was rarely visited, but those who stumbled upon it often paused for longer than they expected. A few even laughed aloud. For history, even the awkward parts has a way of growing gentler over time. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Emu War had transcended the borders of the continent. School children in Canada wrote essays about it. Late-night hosts in New York told the story with incredulous glee. And deep in forums across the internet, debates still simmered. Could drones have turned the tide? Could Australia ever avenge the defeat? But no one really wanted revenge. Not anymore. The emus had won the only kind of victory that matters in the long arc of storytelling. They had walked, unhurried and unflappable, into legend. They had reminded an entire country, and eventually the world, that sometimes the most absurd failures are the ones most worth remembering. And so the sun continued to rise over the western plains, casting long shadows behind tall, flightless birds as they wandered through wheat fields and fence gaps, indifferent to their fame. They made no speeches. They left no monuments, only footprints in the red earth, and a silence that echoed louder than any gunfire ever had. Out on the sun-baked plains of Western Australia, where the sky unfolds like a faded canvas and the land hums with quiet resilience, the emus still roam, unbothered, undeterred, perhaps even unaware that they once starred in what may be the strangest chapter of military history. The Great Emu War was never truly about birds and bullets. It was about what happens when human plans, no matter how rigid, meet the unpredictable rhythm of the natural world. It was about underestimating feathered persistence, overestimating machinery, and learning through embarrassment that nature rarely reads our instruction manuals. In the decades since, the story has taken on a kind of mythic life, not the solemn myth of tragedy, but the bright-eyed myth of absurdity. It is retold not to mock, but to marvel. How strange, we say, how wonderfully human, to organize an army against birds and expect nature to salute. Perhaps that is why the tale endures. In a world that often turns history into dry lists of dates and treaties, the Emu War reminds us that not everything important is serious. Sometimes the stories that stay with us are the ones that make us laugh first, and think afterward. The soldiers who carried Lewis guns into the bush have long since gone. The farmers who watched their wheat vanish beneath thousands of sharp claws have passed their stories on. The emus, though, remain, always just beyond the horizon, always one step ahead. And if you ever find yourself beneath that big, pale sky, where the grass whispers and the heat wavers above the dust, you might just catch the flicker of a long neck in the distance, standing tall, watching you, and somewhere in that gaze a question: back for round two? But no war drums sound now, only the breeze, only the chuckle of history, and the gentle, ongoing march of birds that never needed wings to fly straight into legend.